I want to go back to philosophy proper now. We've been kind of alternating between philosophy and theology, and more philosophy and more theology, although as we've seen they're very much intertwined. Bultmann and Tillich trying very hard to be good existential philosophers as well as being theologians. And so there's a lot of mutual influence here, and really everything that the theologians say about the Word of God has kind of influenced the philosophers too, and talking about the nature of language as an event through which being speaks to us. Well, I hope you've gotten the idea, the 20th century thought. Theology to some, well, theology definitely, and philosophy too. 20th century is the century of language, okay? In 20th century thought, people kind of tire of the old philosophies which try to build up human knowledge by way of metaphysics and epistemology and so on, and they think that you can get new insight into the world by focusing on language. And we've seen that in Karl Barth's emphasis on the Word of God. We've seen that on the in Bultmann's emphasis on the kerygma, the preaching. We've seen that in the post-Bultmannian, the language event people, those who and we see that in Heidegger, of course. Heidegger's emphasis on language as the house of being, language as the way being somehow reveals itself to us. And we're going to see this in just about every philosophical movement that develops in the 20th century, and in most theological movements too. The idea of word, the idea of language, the idea of communication becomes very, very important here. And so my large title for the next period is From Hermeneutics to Postmodernism. We've talked about hermeneutics, the idea that hermeneutics is not just the interpretation of language, but hermeneutics is the revelation of reality through language to us. So let's follow this theme a little further, see how it develops. First, Hans Georg Gadamer, sometimes pronounced Gadamer, I don't know which is the preferred one. Gadamer, notice he was born in 1900, Nietzsche died in 1900, so I don't know if there's anything interesting about that. Anyway, Hans Georg Gadamer, all understanding involves interpretation. Therefore, epistemology is hermeneutic, the study of interpretation. This is kind of this was picked up, of course, by Bultmann's disciples in the 1950s. All inquiry is embedded in horizons of language, history, tradition. We don't know any timeless truths because we know the truth only by way of tradition. We know the truth only by way of experience. We know the truth only by way of history. See how far we've come since Descartes. Descartes thought that you could just push all the tradition and all the history aside and just gain knowledge through the exercise of reason alone. Not in Gadamer. Gadamer says that we are limited in our knowledge by our language, history, and tradition. We cannot know truths without those limits. We can't know the truths beyond those horizons. And so inevitably we approach inquiry with prejudices, just as Bultmann said, there's no exegesis without presuppositions. These prejudices are sometimes reviled. I mean, in the old days, people would say, oh, you got to be objective, you got to be unprejudiced, you got to be unbiased. You can't have any presuppositions. You can't have any prejudices. Well, beginning with Hegel practically, and well, beginning with Kant and moving on, that kind of idea has been refuted, although you still hear it from people sometimes, that bias and prejudice and presuppositions are always bad. But Gadamer, of course, makes this argument very strongly. But he says that presuppositions can be helpful as well as harmful. We can't escape from them, but they help shape the way we gain knowledge, and we do gain knowledge by following our presuppositions and refining our presuppositions, refining our biases as we move from one thing to another. So understanding, interpretation, application require each other. It's important to be active in the world. This is sometimes called praxis, and we'll run into this in liberation theology. It's important to be active in the world, because it's through your activity in the world that your horizons expand and you start to see new things available to you. D, modern science tends to dominate and dehumanize experience. Now, science is a good thing, of course, but remember Heidegger's distinction between pre-theoretical and theoretical. There's a place for science, but there's also a place for naive experience, a place for looking at the world without the constraints of science, looking at the world as a whole rather than just taking a little bit out of the world to analyze scientifically. So we're more confident today that science, although science is a good thing, science imposes some limitations on us. There's a lot that we don't see if we limit our experience to what we can scientifically prove. So modern science does have this tendency, says Gadamer, to dominate and dehumanize experience. We should therefore emphasize praxis, which is responsible decision, over technology. Okay, we should emphasize phronesis, which is practical knowledge, over episteme, which is scientific knowledge, and language is more central than reason. Here he opposes another thinker named Jürgen Habermas, who I won't take time to expound here. But anyway, you can see where he's drifting, that we need to, if we divide our thought into these components, one which is relatively theoretical and technical, and the other is more just understanding the world of experience, kind of the difference between left brain and right brain, I guess. We need both of these, and we shouldn't assume that science gives us everything. We shouldn't assume that science gives us everything we need to know. And that's important. There have been some philosophical movements like logical positivism which say that all knowledge comes through scientific method. Well, Gadamer and Heidegger and Gadamer are very much opposed to that kind of idea. Now I want to talk about a series of thinkers who develop linguistics in a kind of philosophical direction. The first of these is Ferdinand de Saussure, a French writer. You see his dates there, father of modern linguistics. So he's primarily not a philosopher. He's a scientific linguist, and often presented as the father of modern linguistics. And we'll see that, though, that his linguistics leads to some philosophical reflection and to some philosophical movements that become important later on. What are some of the things that Saussure emphasized? First of all, he made a number of distinctions This is often important in philosophy, making distinctions, right, between science and ordinary life, okay, between forms and matter, between the sacred and the secular, if that works, you see. Often that's the way philosophy proceeds, because somebody will say, okay, we're having this problem, maybe we can solve the problem by making a distinction here between this and this. That's very important in philosophy, often important in theology too. Well, Saussure, some of his distinctions. First, distinction between the signifier and the signified, okay? The signifier would be a a sound, or a cultural object like a book or a sentence, a piece of language. Signifier, and the signified is a mental concept. So the word book is a signifier, and that designates a concept of book that I have in my mind. Now, don't get distracted here. I mean, we tend to think that the words in language refer to objects in the world. The word book refers to actual books out there that you might be reading, that you might have in your library. Well, that's our naive way of thinking about it. There are a lot of reasons for denying what's called a referential theory of meaning, but we won't get into that now. That's not what Saussure says. Saussure says the signifier refers to a concept in my mind. All right, there's a mental concept here. This is kind of Cartesian, kind of Augustinian, if you will. The reference of words are in the mind. Then a second distinction between langue and parole. These are French terms. Langue, usually translated, well, both of them are translated language, so this is language in two senses. Langue is the system or structure of language. Parole is a person's actual speaking. So when we talk about the system of French, or we talk about the system of English, we're talking about langue. But when we talk about somebody who's actually standing up here speaking English or speaking French, that's parole. My lecture here is parole. Then you have a distinction between diachronic and synchronic analysis. When you're trying to understand language, there are two things you can do. One is you run into a mysterious tribe and they're using this mysterious term book, okay? Well, what does that term mean? One way you can go about doing that is by doing a history, finding out how it's been used in the history of their culture, looking at how the previous generation used the term and the generation before that, and that often leads you to etymologies. That would be a diachronic analysis. That is analysis taking place looking at the term through time, all right, diachronically. Synchronic analysis has to do with the present day use. Look at how people are using the term book today. How does it play a role in present day language and the present day activities of this particular tribe? And that goes with any word at all. If you run into a tribe that uses the word blip, you can do a diachronic analysis or a synchronic analysis. And you often hear that distinction used in biblical exegesis. What about the term dikaios, just? Well, you can do a historical analysis of that, diachronic analysis, see what its etymology is, what people meant by it 100 years before the Bible, or you can just simply look at the place of dikaios Koine Greek as it was being spoken in the first century. That would be synchronic. And of course, James Barr, a lot of writers on the subject of exegesis have said it's much more important to do synchronic analysis than to do diachronic analysis. It doesn't much matter what the etymology was. What's important is how people are using the word at the time. If you wanted to know the meaning of the word nice, and I told you that it comes from a Latin word meaning ignorant, I'd be telling you the truth, but that wouldn't give you much help as to the meaning of the word nice. It used to mean ignorant, but it doesn't mean ignorant today. Okay, then Saussure also, besides those three distinctions, Saussure also enunciated the thesis that signs are arbitrary. Signs in language are arbitrary. Verbal symbols are conventional, and they're not uniquely appropriate to their objects. In the back of this room is a series of windows. And if I spoke French, well, I'd use the word fenêtre to speak of those objects. Since I speak English, I call them windows. Is window a better term than the term fenêtre? Or is fenêtre better to speak of those objects than window? Well, no, not really. Saussure would have pointed that out, that these terms are chosen to some extent arbitrarily. Of course, they come out of history and they have various backgrounds, and one is more Latin and one is more German and so on and so forth. But neither is uniquely appropriate. Neither is more appropriate than the other to designate that particular object. Often different languages yield different concepts too, because they cut the pie of reality into different shapes. There are some languages that have only 4 words for the different colors, because they divide the color spectrum into 4 parts. There are other languages that have maybe 9 or 10 words, or 24 or 25. My wife can distinguish between burnt sienna and light brown. I don't know. I mean, they used to give you these big boxes of crayons when you were a kid that had maybe 50 different colors in them, and they had odd names like that. I never got to distinguish them very well from one another. But anyway, that's just dividing the color spectrum into 50 parts. Doesn't matter too much. I mean, it's not that these are different views of reality, really, but they do generate different concepts. If you have only 4 color terms in your language, and one of them is brown, well, that word brown is going to cover an awful lot of things, an awful lot more things than the same word would cover if it's one of 50 color terms. So language affects your concepts, it reflects your ideas of things. Saussure says, though, that this means that things don't have fixed essences. Now that's getting really philosophical. Remember, the question of essence is the question of what things really are. And for Plato, it's the question of form. And Plato and Aristotle, the form as opposed to the matter. What Saussure is saying is, the nature of things depends on language. You say, this is a brown table. Well, it's a brown table presupposing the English meaning of the term brown. But if you spoke a different language, you would not only use a different term, but you would make different kinds of contrasts between this and other things. So when you ask, what is the table? What is its essence? That varies depending on the language that you speak. Capital E, language is a system. The position of a term in the system of language determines its meaning. The important thing about a word is not its sound, but its differences from other words. That's an important principle, and you should study that when you do exegesis. Saussure influenced a lot of other linguists, Noam Chomsky's transformational grammar, R. Jacobson, and others who maintained that, Chomsky wrote a book called Cartesian Linguistics, where he argued that words reflect a system of thought in the mind that everybody shares. Kind of like Platonic universals, thoughts in the mind that everybody shares, so you sometimes hear the term deep structure. Of course, French and English are different. Italian is still different. Swahili is different. Chinese is different. But they're all trying somehow to express the same things, the same basic ideas, the same basic concepts. That's where linguistics crosses over into philosophy. On page 147, I have a short discussion of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who deserves a lot more attention, but he's another structuralist. We call people like Saussure and Chomsky and others who talk about these deep structures in the mind, we call them structuralists. And Claude Lévi-Strauss is neither he's not primarily a linguist, and he's not primarily a philosopher. He's an anthropologist. He's a sociologist. He studies anthropological phenomena as language, particularly mythology, using a model derived from Saussure. So he argues that societies are organized according to various forms of communication and exchange. And that communication consists not only of words, but also of objects, artistic objects that are exchanged between members of a tribe. And customs, anthropological customs, ways by which young children come of age, and ceremonies that are given to them, and all of that all has a kind of linguistic structure to it, and they all come out of these deep structures of the mind. Symbolic elements have no fixed interpretations. They vary with their position in the myth. Use of language, bringing it out, making it public, always brings some loss of individuality. Language must be understood in terms of society. Now that's structuralism, but structuralism leads to a reaction. There are a lot of people who think this is kind of a mysterious thing, these structures in the mind, and they become rather skeptical of that. They come to think, no, we don't all have these common structures. We think differently, and we need to recognize the difference between one person's thought and another person's thought. And this skepticism over structuralism leads to a movement called deconstruction, and another name for deconstruction is postmodernism, okay? Postmodern philosophy. I won't try to explain the use of that term to you. It's very paradoxical. How can anything be postmodern? If modern is what's going on now, then postmodernism hasn't happened yet, right? But these terms are conventional, and it's become common to describe certain kinds of philosophy as postmodern because, the contrast is this, that modern thought is very confident of itself, very rationalistic, very scientific. Postmodern is more skeptical of these assurances, more skeptical of the certainty, skeptical of science, skeptical of the sufficiency of theoretical thought, skeptical of technology, and so on and so forth. So we're looking at the skeptical side now, sometimes called postmodernism, sometimes called deconstruction. And some of the names associated with this: Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault. Jacques Lyotard ought to be there too. I believe he's in your bibliography. He's probably the most important figure in the movement. Now, like structuralism, deconstruction stresses language, but it argues that the signifiers of signs are other signs rather than objective realities. Now, what Saussure said is that you have the signifier, which refers to a concept in the mind. This was in the direction of subjectivity, because some philosophers had said that signifiers are signs of stuff in the world. But now these deconstructionists come and say, look, if you're looking to find what a sign represents, if you're looking to find out what a sign designates, signs designate other signs, all right? There is no underlying system for signs to reveal. They don't refer to some system of thought in the mind. Rather, they just have their own relationships to one another. You ask me what the word book means, and I tell you book means paper bound together in such a way with text on it of a certain size. So you ask me the meaning of a word, I give you other words, all right? You ask me the meaning of a sign, and I give you other signs. Saussure said the meaning of the sign is a concept in the mind, but I can't give you what's in my mind. I can only give you what I can say. I can only give you language. So you can't really get outside of language. Language is self-contained. Furthermore, you can't imagine that through language you're going to get some insight into the universe, into metaphysics. Derrida says, look, there's no way of getting from discourse to philosophy. And he favors deconstruction. Typically this kind of deconstructionist discussion takes place in college seminars, and somebody brings in a text that they've been reading, and maybe the text is a philosophical text. The text intends to tell us that the world is one, let's say. Well, Derrida will sit there and say, okay, this text purports to prove that the universe is one, but what does it really say? Well, it's a text by one person who only has this finite vision, and furthermore, it's a person who's maybe he's got a girlfriend, maybe he has financial problems. His overall concern is not to gain knowledge for its own sake. His concern is for himself. His concern is to try to enhance his position in the world and to put other people down. So when you look closely at language, language doesn't tell you about the world. Language only tells you about itself. Language tells you, analyzing language undermines its purported philosophical presuppositions. In written language, the author is not present to describe its intentions. Okay, now let's say you've got a seminar in college discussing Pride and Prejudice. And one person says he thinks that the main theme of it is this, and someone else says, no, I think the main theme of it is that. And somebody else says, well, wouldn't it be nice if Jane Austen were here to tell us what the real theme is? She could tell us what her intention was. She could tell us what she intended to write. That's no good. If the teacher is a deconstructionist, the teacher would say, no, no, no. The author is not here. And even if the author were here, the author wouldn't have authority over us to tell us what it means. We have the same right to tell what the text means as Jane Austen did. Because when Jane Austen published her book, she put it out in the public forum. And language is a public thing. The meaning of book is determined by the public. It's a public consensus. You go to the dictionary. You don't go to a particular author to find out what it means. You decide for yourself. The meaning of terms is identified by the hearers, by the readers, not by the authors of the language. So even the author cannot authoritatively declare the meaning of a text. And so for all of these reasons, Derrida says it's hopeless to try to find objective truth in language. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. There's a subjective dimension. But, man, I mean, that's going pretty far. I think I would, if Jane Austen were to offer to come and tell me what Pride and Prejudice is all about, I certainly wouldn't tell her to stay home, you know. I think it would be a great advantage to have the author present. And, of course, you know, what we're all getting at here is what does the Bible mean? And what if we had the Apostle Paul here? Could the Apostle Paul tell us? Now, I understand the point about the meaning of words being public. Now, I had this experience when I wrote a book called, it was R.C. Sproul. He wrote a book called Classical Apologetics, and I reviewed it. And one of the funny things about that book was that there was a typo. And when R.C. Sproul was intending to talk about the noetic effects of sin with an N, noetic effects of sin, instead there was this typo and it said poetic effects of sin. Well, I joked a little bit that R.C. was maybe trying to talk about the poetic inspiration of the devil or something like that. Wasn't very funny. But anyway, that's what can happen. Now, let's say that R.C. were to come in to our discussion, and R.C. were to say, well, no, when I wrote that word, I meant noetic. I did not mean poetic. Does he have the authority to say that? Well, in a way, kind of. I mean, we at least learn what his intention is, and we kind of understand him a little better. But I'm sorry, R.C., the word poetic does not mean noetic. And you can't, you can't use the word poetic in such a way as to make it mean noetic. The meaning of the term is not what you say it means. The meaning of the term is what it says in the dictionary. The meaning of the term is what we've agreed on in society, the way we've agreed to use that term. So, in a sense, you know, the meanings of words, meanings are public. Meanings are not individual, and the author is not always in control of what he says. I have people coming up to me often who say, did you mean to say this in your book, The Doctrine of the Knowledge of God? And I say, well, I wasn't thinking of that, but you know, that's there. Maybe you can get that out of it. Every author has that interesting experience that readers will get things out of the book that you hadn't intended to put in, and sometimes they get things out of your book that are legitimate. So, you know, we can talk about that. But words mean what they mean. Words do have objective meanings. The term poetic does not mean noetic. And the term poetic does not mean what anybody thinks it means. I mean, Derrida is right. The author can't use the word to mean anything, but the seminar can't use the word to mean anything either. There is an objective limitation on our interpretation of texts, and that's something that postmodernism really doesn't get.